Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. My name is Christiana. I'm an alumna of Geneva Business School. I studied international management on the Geneva campus and I graduated in 2019. I liked the school so much that once I graduated, I joined the administration and more precisely the admissions department. So I will be more than happy to answer any questions you may have at the end of this session. So today we'll be hearing from Damien Bezançon, a professor and the academic dean here in Geneva campus. He'll be talking to us about tomorrow's economy, which will have a taste of how the future of business will look like, and more importantly, what it should be like. So to make sure that we have the clearest connection possible, please keep your microphones off, on mute. Daniela, can you hear us? Thank you very much. So without further ado, here is Mr. Bezançon.
Thank you very much, Christiana. It's a great pleasure for me to be with all of you today digitally, and it's a great honor as well to see that you are all over the world, and it's such a diverse audience. So I'm really pleased to be with you today. I'm going to share my presentation with you now, and you should see it now. So indeed, the topic for today is tomorrow's economy. So how are we going to discuss that? Well, we'll start briefly by having a look at the previous crises, 3 of them, that will give us some insights on what we can expect in the coming months or maybe years. And then very quickly we'll see that the public sector will be in the picture, and more precisely the central banks. They are a bit of an unknown superhero, but they clearly are superheroes. Unfortunately, they are not invincible superheroes, so we'll see what that leads us to. And then we will ponder the question of why moving to Mars would be a failure. There is a connection between central banks and moving to Mars. I assure you there is. We'll see that in a few moments. And after having discussed the idea of settling rather on the south side, on the north side of Mars, we'll be discussing indeed tomorrow's economy and, as Christiana said, what it should look like, definitely. So that being said, let's start with a history of recent crises. So we'll see 3 of them, the 1973 oil shock, the 2001 dot-com bubble, and the 2008 subprime crisis. We could argue that there were other crises in the past, 1987, the Black Monday, some problems with the Eurozone also in 2012 and beyond, etc. But I chose these 3 so that each and every one of them tells us something about the 2020 crisis. Starting with the 1973 oil shock, basically the OPEC, so the Association of Oil Producing Countries, decided for geopolitical reasons to stop the oil production. And oil being already back then a very important input in the economy, production was endangered because there was not enough oil coming, and therefore production decreased. And because production decreased, less people could actually buy things, and therefore we started a crisis. So that's what we call a supply side crisis, supply side shock. That was the 1973 oil shock crisis. Then fast forward to 2001, we have the dot-com bubble burst. So in the late 90s, everybody started believing that internet was the absolute magical solution to everything. It would solve absolutely all it would be a revolution so big that nothing couldn't be sold through internet. Then many people invested on the stock exchange, and anyone would give you stock advice. Cab drivers, hairdressers, bartenders, everyone would tell you how to invest and would give you stock tips and so on. So that was a clear sign of a bubble. There was too much money invested in those stocks. And those stocks, some of them did survive the crisis. So we had eBay, for example, Amazon. They were already trading back then, and they are still alive today, and alive and kicking for some of them, we could say. But many other companies just were the effect of a hype. I remember a startup that created on the idea of consulting with companies on the basis of how the ants, you know, the insects, the ants, get organized. And just by putting the two magical words, startup and internet, this company managed to raise $4 million for just observing the ants in the garden. So this one obviously disappeared very quickly. So that was the dot-com hype, and afterwards the crisis. The dot-com crisis led to a demand-side shock or demand-side crisis, because all the money that had been invested in the stock markets was lost. And if you add to that 9/11 terrorist attacks, and people got scared, had lost money, and the combination of the two effects is that they started spending less. So demand decreased, and therefore a crisis started that way because there was less demand. So 1973 supply side crisis, 2001 demand side crisis, and now 2008 subprime crisis. I'm sure all of you have heard of it one way or another. So to summarize briefly what happened back then, certain people in the United States of America thought it was a good idea to lend huge amounts of money to people who couldn't afford it to buy houses. And at some point, all these bad loans ended up on the balance sheets of the banks, and the banks got into very big trouble. So how did we solve the 2008 crisis? I put it, in brackets because it has not necessarily been solved. In fact, when the banks came into trouble, two very big banks, actually, American banks got bankrupt, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. But for the rest of the banking system, it was deemed too big to fail. We'll use that expression again a bit later on, and not only for banks this time. So they were deemed too big to fail, which means that if the entire banking system failed, the entire economy would fail with it. Why? Because banks lend money to the companies. All the payment systems are run through the banks. We have our savings at the bank, etc. So we could not let them go down. So public money came in and bailed out the banks. And that's what you see on the drawing at the bottom. Basically, public money is eventually taxpayers. So the problem was passed on to taxpayers and central banks. That's what we learned from the 2008 crisis. First, the public pockets have to come to the rescue, and second, eventually it becomes a problem for the taxpayers. So supply side shock, demand side shock, and these two things about the 2008 crisis. Before we get into more details about the 2020 crisis, an interesting thing to note. We knew that crisis would come. As you can see on the right of the slide here, I copied you a slide I presented in February 2018. So 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, where we saw already very clearly a bubble inflating in the US. And I put there the quote, "Trees don't grow to the sky." And we see that's exactly what has happened. Effectively, the stock markets have plunged since then. So I was obviously not the only one to announce that and to discuss that. Of course, we all knew about it. But yeah, it was already known. So we knew it would come, but we did not know how it would start. That was the interesting factor. And I remember discussing with my students a few hypotheses. So in 2008, we were talking about hedge funds. It was in the news all the time, hedge funds pose a systematic threat, etc. It started from subprime, so exactly another direction. And for this 2020 crisis, we had listed geopolitics, so US-China trade war, for example. We had listed cryptocurrencies. These ones were kind of my favorite. They had everything in place to generate a crisis. There was starting to be a bubble, irrational hype, funds were created to invest in cryptocurrencies. Very few people understood what it was about, but everybody spoke about it. So that was the perfect thing. But no, didn't come from there. I lost my bet. Then there was shadow banking as well, which is all the sector that has replaced the banks since 2008 for the assets that the banks cannot hold anymore. Interest rates increase and so on and so on. We could make a very long list of all of these. And eventually, nowhere on my list was listed this tiny little virus that has attacked us. So we knew it would come. We didn't know how it would start, and once again, it surprised us. So that being said, we have been in a health crisis for quite a while, and we start seeing really the effects of this economic crisis that is coming now. So what shall we expect? Well, I'm sorry to begin with that, but keep calm and fasten your seatbelt. And for a seatbelt, you'd better choose one like on the slide here, like a very strong and sophisticated one, not the simple one you have on your car, because we're up for a very bumpy ride. That's going to last a few months minimum, and most probably some years. Why are we in this situation? Well, basically because we are starting this crisis in an already quite fragile position. We are definitely not in rude health, as we could say. We are starting in a position that is a bit weak. I'm listing here only 3 points to explain that weakness. I think for me they are the 3 main points, but we could list other things too. The first one is that corporate debt, so the debt taken on by companies, is already very high, and it's even at its all-time highest. And we see a strange phenomenon appearing, which is called zombie companies. Sounds a bit like a movie, zombie movie, like walking around. Just here it's companies. It's a bit weird. What is a zombie company? It's a company that does not generate profit, that basically refinances its losses through debt all the time and takes on more debt and more debt and more debt to stay alive. And quite surprisingly, the investment bank Natixis has estimated that 15%, 1/5, of all companies are already zombies. That's quite scary. I can give you 2 examples of those. I'm sure you will know about them. Tesla, and we'll speak about Tesla again afterwards. Tesla has been losing money since its creation, and it's permanently refinancing. That's the way Tesla is going. So Tesla, de facto, is a zombie company. And another one, very small company, very tiny little thing, General Electric. The tiny thing was a sarcastic comment, of course you got that. General Electric has currently on its balance sheet more than $100 billion in debt. So if it has to repay the debt, if it has to even face a slight increase in the interest rate, that will mean big trouble for General Electric. So first point, we already have some 15% zombie companies. And when you are highly indebted, then a crisis is even more dangerous for you. So that's the first problem. Second problem, the European economy was slowing down anyway before the crisis. And I didn't write it here, but we could say the same about the Chinese economy and some other economies worldwide as well. So starting up again will be even more difficult because we are already at the end of an expansion cycle. And the third problem is that our usual weapon of mass retaliation to counter the crisis, which is decreasing the interest rates, this is already maxed out. The interest rates are already super low. They are even negative in Europe and in some other countries. So currently, these days, if you borrow 100 in Europe, you only give back 99. It's crazy. You obtain money for the benefit of actually borrowing that money. It's the world upside down. So that weapon, lowering interest rates to help the economy start again, is already maxed out. So in a way, all that makes me think of the world economy as someone who is clinically dead. You know, clinically dead, but you inject a bit of adrenaline, you inject some drugs, you inject some nutrients and so on, and you keep it going. But that's that zombie economy that stumbled on the COVID now, and we are not really starting from a very strong position. So we are entering the crisis in an already fragile position, and we have a crisis that is the combination of supply side shock and demand side shock. Supply side, why? Because the workforce being locked down at home, nothing can be produced. And even if we are being de-locked down and we can start again, there is always the risk of second waves that have happened in certain countries already, etc. So the production is anyway in trouble. And besides, we've got the issue of international supply chains that have been really affected. And so on the supply side, we can't supply and produce as much as before. So we already have a shock there. On the demand side, same story. People are locked down at home, so can't spend. We can spend a bit online, but not necessarily everything. And besides that, we also have this classical saving reflex. We know difficult times are coming, and so we tend to save for the future. And therefore, we actually spend less than we spent before. The only previous time where this happened in the recent past was World War II, and that was 75 years ago. So we are facing a crisis that is in its nature kind of a repetition of something that we lived or went through for the first time 75 years ago. So that's kind of a big one. So entering in there in a fragile position, having a double shock, and yeah, that's our situation. So what are we facing exactly? What is the mechanism of a crisis starting? That's the recessionary vicious circle. We see that because of the demand side shock and the supply side shock, we've got two effects. People spend less and companies produce less. These two things have one effect. Companies sell less. If companies sell less, then they have to reduce their costs. You've got less revenue. You had revenue here, cost here. Revenue goes there. If you want to continue generating a profit, you've got to lower your costs. And in the whole cycle, or in the whole group of things you can do to reduce costs, one of them is to lay off staff. If you lay off staff, more people will be unemployed, and therefore people will spend less, and here we go. We've got this cycle that turns and turns again, and if nothing is done, basically the economy can crumble completely. So this has to be stopped, and that's the most important thing. We have to stop this recessionary vicious circle. The best solution to do that is what? Reintroduce confidence. If you introduce confidence into that vicious circle, people will feel more confident. Being more confident, they will spend more. Companies will be more confident, they will invest to produce more, and therefore companies will sell more. So they will hire more people, they will distribute more salaries and people will spend more. And this vicious circle that goes down will become a virtuous circle that goes up. So yeah, we have it. We've got the magical answer. Put confidence back into the system. Unfortunately, today it's not an option. We can't do that. We can't do that because we still have uncertainties about this virus. We were talking about second waves. We were talking about maybe mutation of the virus to become deadlier or whatever. Besides, we still have a lot of geopolitical tensions, the US-China trade war, and at the end of the day, we also have a president of the United States who advises people to drink chlorine and swallow light bulbs to fight against the virus. So all of that makes that confidence today is not an option. So since we can't have our magical solution, then we need to move to guerrilla tactics. And a guerrilla tactic would be here to break a few links in this terrible chain so that it stops and maybe move in the other direction. So we'll be targeting two links here: people spending less and companies selling less. How do we do that? Well, very simply by giving them money. That's very simple. If we give money to people, then they will spend more. And if we give money to companies, they don't have to reduce their cost because they have more money. Good. So that's all then. Yeah. Tiny question. Where does the money come from? Enter the public pockets to the rescue. Public pockets to the rescue. So how is it going to work? States will take on debt. They will borrow money, and by borrowing money, they will actually help companies and people do that. The only issue we have here is that public debt is already in many countries really, really high. You can see here a list of certain countries and their debt to GDP ratio. GDP is gross domestic product, so it's the entire value produced by one country in 1 year. You see that Japan, for example, we would need to take all that value produced by the entire country for 2.4 years to repay the debt. Impossible to do because GDP has to be used for many other things. So the level of debt in Japan is extremely high, but same goes for Italy, Singapore, United States, etc. We're starting from that position already. And what is going to happen? Basically, debt to GDP ratio is mathematically the formula debt divided by GDP. If we ask states to give more money to people and take on debt, the debt will increase. And in the meantime, because we can fight off the vicious circle, but we can't stop it completely, GDP will go down. And that mathematically means that the debt to GDP ratio will go really high. From there on, we can ask ourselves a question. We are entering this crisis with an already high debt to GDP ratio, and we are going to increase it. So when is public debt being repaid? Well, apparently the answer in the last 40 years has been never. We just don't. I show you here two graphs for the United States, and the one on the top left is a comparison, an evolution of debt to GDP ratio. So you see that from World War II to 1980, this ratio goes down, and since 1980, it goes up. The only moment where it goes down a little bit is at the end of the 1990s. But in nominal terms, so the actual amount of debt that has been taken in dollars is the graph you see on the bottom right, the blue line. Even in the 1990s, in nominal terms, the debt increased. And the most worrying part here, unfortunately, is that in the last 8 years, at least since 2012, we've been, or the United States have been, in an economic expansion. And during the economic expansions, we could think that the debt is being repaid. No, the debt increased. So the United States of America have taken on more debt during the last 8 years, and even it increased faster than in previous periods of time. So the debt increases and increases and increases. We have the example of the US there, but the same goes for almost all G20 countries, the top 20 economies worldwide. And that's the situation we have. So I don't know about you, but when I go to the bank and I ask for a loan, my banker, if he or she says yes, one of the main conditions for that is to be repaid at some point. And here we see that we're just lending to the States and it never gets repaid. So who is crazy enough to lend to the States? Well, bad news, you and I, basically, you and I. Anyone who has money on the bank indirectly lends that money to the States. Why? Because banks accept our money in deposits. So be it checking account, current account, savings account, as long as you deposit money in the bank will manage that money for you. And one of the key assets that banks invest in are public debt. So without knowing it, we do lend to this increasing, and apparently never-ending increase in public debt. So that's the first group. Anyone who has money in the bank lends money to the States. The second group are institutional investors, so insurance companies, pension funds, etc. And the third group, probably the smallest one in terms of number of institutions, are the central banks. So here enter the central role of central banks. But before we get there, okay, let's see what we've seen. Companies obtain money from the states. Okay. States obtain money from the banks. Okay. Banks obtain money from the central banks. Okay, so, right, it's getting boring. Who lends to the central banks? Let's get to the bottom of that thing. There's an apparently endless line of borrowing. So who is the last lender? Well, that's in fact the central banks. Nobody lends to the central banks because central banks actually print money. They can print it as you see on the picture there, but in fact, most of it today is done electronically. So by printing money, they just press a button on the keyboard, someone in the central bank building somewhere, and money appears almost magically. So it sounds indeed like we found the magical solution. Trouble in the economy through a chain of companies and banks and so on. We put money into the business and that solves everything. Yeah, well, what are the consequences of that? We have to see if magics can do the trick, if magics can solve the situation. So what are the consequences? Yeah, before we get to that, spoiler alert number one, Santa and the Tooth Fairy do not exist. I hope you already knew that, because if you do, then you won't be too surprised to learn, spoiler alert number two, that central banks are not Harry Potter. They don't have a magic wand, and they can't actually solve everything on their own just by printing money. So to understand really the consequences of printing money, we first need to understand how it's done, and for that we need to start with the balance sheet of companies and normal banks, so commercial banks. Now here I'm going to talk about accounting. Ooh, bad. I know nobody likes accounting. So I promise I'm going to be very quick on that, and I'm not going to use any difficult jargon. We go through that quickly, and then don't worry, we'll move on to normal things. It's important to understand the balance sheets of companies and normal banks, because what matters really here will be the balance sheet of central banks. So we start there to get to the central banks. What do we have? So the balance sheet of a company is the document that summarizes what the company invested in, so what the company owns. So for example, machine, cars or trucks, computers, so all the things that the company needs to work and produce what it has to produce. And on the other side, we've got how it is financed. Okay? Equity is the money from the shareholders, so shareholders are the owners of the company, they put money into the business, and loans and bonds. So liabilities are borrowings from the bank, so the loan that you obtain from your bank. The same goes for private individuals, basically. If you want to buy an apartment, for example, you would put some money yourself and you would borrow money from the bank. So you would have your own little balance sheet. Now, if we look at a normal bank, normal banks have on their assets, well, the loans to companies and states. So they lend money to companies and states. We've seen that a bit before. On our behalf, the banks lend money to the states. And how do they finance that? Well, they finance it a bit in the same way as the company and slightly differently. Same way because there is money from shareholders. So the owners of the bank put money in there. Then there are our deposits. So our deposits, it's the money we put there, and that will flow through the assets to companies and states, and borrowings. They can borrow from each other, but they can also borrow from the central bank. So what does the central bank borrowing look like? We see that the assets of the bank are the liabilities of the company. In the same way, the liabilities of the normal bank will be the assets of central banks. Here is a graph with a lot of complex information and complicated words, mortgage-backed securities and so on. So don't be scared, we'll simplify that. Okay, we'll simplify that by drawing, in the same way as for companies and banks, a balance sheet with assets and liabilities. The assets are the blue parts, so the part on top. And if we translate mortgage-backed securities, it's a complicated word to say lending to the economy through the banks. Okay, so lend a loan to the banks, and these loans are given to or extended to companies. Treasury notes and bonds are public debt, once again through the banks. So central banks lend money to banks, and the banks lend that money to states. That's the asset side. On the liability side, how do central banks finance these assets? How do they purchase them? That's where the seemingly magic thing happens. They just create currency. Reserves, the second portion of the liability, reserves, to simplify, are, let's say, would-be currencies. So more or less, you could consider that all the liabilities of the central banks are currencies. So on the one hand, they are lending money to the economy. On the other hand, they are creating money. Well, sounds relatively simple. However, it is not without consequences. Let's see and before we see that, in theory, there is no upwards limit to that. Central banks could, in theory, increase the size of their balance sheet to an unlimited amount, in theory. So I share with you a quote that I read one day in a book that made me laugh and think at the same time, which is probably the definition of a good quote, by the way. And the quote went like that: one day, I will go live in theory, because in theory, everything will be fine. Yeah, in theory only. So in theory, no upwards limit. In the real world, yep, to be seen. So how does that work? To summarize what we've seen until now. Banks lend money to states and to companies. When a crisis comes, the states lend or even give money to companies and the people. So states get in trouble. Because it is a crisis, companies get in trouble as well. So if you look at the arrows backwards, the trouble flows back to the assets of the banks. And the assets of the banks get in trouble, so the banks get in trouble. And in 2008, we've seen banks are too big to fail. We can't let them go bankrupt because the entire economic system would fall down with them. That's where central banks come in. And what happens there? Well, we will put the trouble here in the central bank, and in exchange for trouble, we will put cash in the bank. So central banks create money or cash in exchange for troubled assets. You see that I've put a little crown on top of cash because cash is king. So if you're taking the troubles away from the bank and you're replacing it with cash, then the situation should be going well for the banks. And eventually, if the economic cycle turns, then companies will go well as well. And we'll end up with that situation here. We've removed the problems from the economy and from the banks, and we've transferred these problems to public debt and central banks. So the cash that we create, that central banks create, is backed on the other side, on the asset side, by troubled assets. To understand why it's a problem, let's have a look at what money really is. Money before was backed by gold. Until 1971, there was a system called the Bretton Woods system, and money was backed by gold. If you had $1, $1 was the equivalent of 1/35th of 1 ounce of gold. Gold, everybody knows what it is. We have even terrible examples of people in extermination camp in World War II who managed to trade bread for gold. Bread was the absolutely vital asset in that environment, and gold was the absolute useless asset. If this transaction could happen in this situation, it means that gold still has a value, even in the most desperate situation. So it's really embedded into almost our DNA that gold is worth something. So if you tell me $1 is worth a few grams of gold, fine. I see, I can relate to that. Since 1971, the Bretton Woods system stopped, and now we exchange it for another system. We don't have reserves in gold anymore, as we have seen. We've got currency backed by assets purchased by central banks. So the money is backed by two things: the trust we have in the central banks and in public institutions generally, the trust that things go well, that governments can properly function, that central banks are well managed, etc. But the second thing that backs our assets today is troubled assets. So today, $1 is equal to the trust we put in the central bank. So you've got a picture here of Mr. Jerome Powell, J. Powell for his friends, who is the president of the Federal Reserve, and so that and a pile of smelly assets. I don't know about you, but the left side with the gold thing sounds much better to me than the right side. So we are backing our currency, the thing that we all use, kind of the blood into the economic body. We are backing that with troubled assets. That's where we're entering into the territories of economy fiction, like science fiction. In the last 14 years, the size of the balance sheets of the main central banks in the world has been multiplied by 5. In the meantime, the world GDP has been multiplied by 2. There's a disconnect between the two that is much too big. And as we say in the financial markets, trees don't grow to the sky. There is a limit to what we can do. So we see there on the graph that in 2019, central banks tried to decrease the size of their balance sheets. You see, it's going down a little bit. And at that point in time, we learned 2 things. The first one, financial markets hated it completely. That's the comment there. Market volatility has increased. In normal, plain English words, it's financial markets hated it. Traders really didn't want it. And they absolutely did not want the cash to stop flowing to the economy. The second thing that we learned is that in spite of the risk it created on the financial markets, the volatility and all of that, central banks did it anyway. They started reducing their balance sheet. So indirectly, they admitted that having so many assets was not a good thing. So it's not a positive thing to have these piles, huge piles of troubled assets there. Now you see that the decrease has continued a little bit, but 2 weeks ago we went up to 25.3 trillion. So a trillion is 1,000 billion, is a million, $25.3 trillion on May 6th. That's my own estimate. It can be discussed marginally, but it's we are more or less there. Okay, so it's an unprecedented high. It's growing and it's not stopping. So really, the question is, how long can we pile up crap and create money backed by it until no one trusts that money anymore? Until we all start saying, yeah, you know what, euro banknotes, dollar banknotes, I don't trust them. And well, the main question we should ask ourselves is, how can we reverse the situation? The answer is certainly not by moving to Mars. Yeah, why moving to Mars would be a failure? Well, to understand why it would be, we should continue our train of thought. And we should think of ways to reduce the central bank's balance sheets. Okay, because we've seen that that's creating trouble. Even central bankers themselves start admitting it's not a good thing. So how do we do that? And a good way to start would be to reduce public debt. We've seen it ending up through the banks on the balance sheet of the central bank. So we should do that. We should start by reducing public debt. So question, why don't we repay public debt? Effectively, a liberal economist would tell you, yeah, that's not the question. Debt has a stable market, and in liberal economy, market is the truth. Market is the absolute thing. So there is a stable market for debt. So whether we repay it or not, that's not the question. The market tells us everything is fine. Yeah, let me disagree a little bit with that. Why? Because in the recent past, what we have seen can be described as the privatization of profits and the socialization of losses. What does that mean? That means that in bad times, we see that banks are too big to fail, so we have to lend them money to save them so that the economy can continue. So that's what we call socialization of losses, because public money goes to the banks, and now we will see it's starting going to the companies as well. So the losses created in the economy are basically transferred to the public, and the public is us. State debt is the debt that is created by governments on our behalf, us citizens. So we socialize the losses in bad times. And in good times, what happens? In good times, generally, we should repay this debt, because the debt helped in bad times, and so it should be repaid in good times. But that's not what happens. That's not what happens enough to actually repay the debt, because we've seen it keeps increasing. So the basic Keynesian theory from John Keynes was that you create deficit in bad times, and through the debt, you repay the deficit in good times. But today, it does not happen, because companies and banks tell the states, yeah, the time are good, but please cut the taxes, because otherwise we won't create jobs. And if we don't create jobs, then that's going to be a problem. Effectively, what happens? You see an example here, and that's just one example among, unfortunately, too many. You've got a picture here of billionaire Richard Branson, Sir Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin, big company in the UK that does a number of things, but the most famous one is it's an airline company. And for the last 14 years, he has lived very comfortably in his own private Caribbean island that has the tiny little specialty of being a tax-free territory. So for the last 14 years, Richard Branson has received dividends from his company and has not paid any taxes on that. Now, a few weeks ago, he launched an appeal to the British government and said he needed a £5 million check, nothing less than that, to save the company. Otherwise, jobs would be destroyed. So that's a perfect example of that. When times are going well, no taxes are being paid. When trouble comes, yeah, we ask for the state to save the companies. So the simple fact of seeing private wealth growing and public debt growing too is enough evidence to say that the privatization of profits, which is advertised as the only solution to create jobs, does not work. If it did, enough jobs would be created, enough salaries would be distributed, and enough taxes would be paid to reduce public debt. It's almost mathematical. So, and we see that's not what is happening. So, why is it a problem? I mean, we could go with the liberal economists and say, yeah, there is a market for it, so the market is happy. So, why is it a problem? Well, first problem is that if you have debt, you have to pay interest on your debt. And to give you an example, the taxes raised on private individuals in France, so the taxes I pay myself, serve all the taxes from all the people in France serve to one thing only, which is paying the interest on the debt. If the country didn't have debt at all, we could spend all that money by improving the public investment into hospitals, the legal system and the tribunals and so on, by doing all of that. So instead of that, we have to cut to reduce public spending. And that's a problem because it reduces the health and the confidence of workers. If you can't get treated properly, it's a problem. If you have to take on the justice for something and it's going to be extremely long and problematic, then you don't do that. So it's generating eventually bad productivity and lower consumer spending. That's leading to a sluggish economy. Second thing, if we raise taxes to start or to pay for the cost of the debt and all of that, well, taxes will mean less money in the pockets of the people and the companies, and therefore a lower ability to pay. So the same thing as a demand side shock, but not really a shock, but over time decrease, and it leads to a sluggish economy. So eventually, having debt, you see the link, having debt is bad for businesses because a sluggish economy is bad for businesses. So say again, you don't want to pay taxes. Say that again. And that's indeed what certain billionaires say. In fact, when they say they want to move to Mars because some inevitable, in their own words, trouble will affect mankind on Earth, might lead to their inevitable extinction. Well, I think their accumulation of wealth is the main cause of that trouble. It is because it mechanically corresponds to the dangerous accumulation of public debt that will eventually damage the economy and billions of workers that they create that trouble. So that is much more a cause of unavoidable trouble than global warming, asteroids hitting the Earth, or things like that. So instead of considering moving to Mars and dreaming about taking their surpluses to Mars, the surpluses they have accumulated, and leaving behind the Earth with the accumulated deficits, they should think of getting these wealth to circulate again. Wealth has to flow. It cannot be isolated in the bank safe somewhere. It has to flow. Otherwise, it leads to the troubles we have described, the accumulation of trouble on the balance sheet of the central banks, which eventually threaten our currencies, and the accumulation of public debt, which eventually threaten the economy. So to solve that, the solution is not to move to Mars. And the solution is to actually reinject wealth in the system and make sure surpluses and deficits together go down, and that the wealth is shared in a more equitable way. So here's the case for wealth circulation. In good times, money goes mostly to private pockets and a little bit goes to public pockets, not enough to reduce the debt, apparently. So here we accumulate cash and here we accumulate deficits. In bad times, well, some little money goes wherever it can, but mostly money comes from the public sector and goes to the private sector to help it, because it's too big to fail, because we can't take the risk of having the economy collapsing, etc., etc. So the pile of cash increases, and the hole increases as well. So there's one very important thing we need to do here. In good times, we need to start finding the way for this green arrow to exist again. You will see that I drew it in green for some reason. It's coming up soon. So we need to find a way to have the wealth circulating back to the public in good times, and not considering putting it on a rocket to launch it to Mars. That makes no sense at all. So, what's tomorrow's economy? Well, if we seriously consider moving wealth and the world off to Mars, it means our system has failed miserably. Therefore, what is tomorrow's economy? Well, tomorrow's economy needs to be reinvented. The current economy, the way we know it, has failed. So we need to reinvent that economy. Sure, good idea. So where shall we start then? Yeah, well, what about listening? Circulate, thing I've been telling you for quite a while now, sounds very much like circle. And yeah, we could watch a bit more as well. We could listen a bit more, watch a bit more. And what could we watch? We could watch nature. Nature is circular by nature, I would almost say. We only, as humans, supposedly Homo sapiens sapiens, twice sapiens, which means wise, at least if we could show that we are only once sapiens, that would be something. Only us could draw a food chain with the predators on top, and us super predators on top of the predators. Well, in fact, sorry for the lion and the eagle, they will be eaten by worms at some point. And so the picture on the top there is not how nature works. Nature works as the picture on the bottom there. Even the super predator, when it dies, will be eaten by worms and will be decomposed by a fungus, and that will generate enough nutrients so that the grass grows and the cycle starts again. So nature, by essence, is circular, and nature has been thriving for millions of years. On the other hand, our economy has existed for, at best, 2 centuries, and as well as our flow of wealth, our economy is linear. The main model for our economy is extracting stuff, moving that stuff to places where it will be transformed, use the stuff until it's broken, and then waste it. Linear all across. There is no circle back to extracting. We do a bit of recycling and so on, but it's a tiny little amount compared to the extraction. At every stage of this transformation, we have to use oil. Now, we could debate endlessly about the peak oil. Have we extracted more than half the reserves on Earth, etc.? That's not the question. At some point, anyway, anyhow, these resources that we extract, be it oil or minerals and so on, will dry out because the Earth produces them very slowly and much slower than we consume them. So unless we start eating waste, there will be a limit to this model. We need to reinvent the economy in full, and we need to do something new. So that's what we believe is the importance for your studies at Geneva Business School. Working on tomorrow's economy, what it should look like, not continuing that and modifying it a bit here and there, but really contributing to the new economy, contributing to tomorrow positively. Where shall we start? I'm going to give you a number of examples, a few things that can really make a difference. The first one, obviously, you saw it coming, circular economy, not linear anymore, circular economy. How could we define circular economy? Well, very simply, we could say your output is your future input. What you produce can enter your production chain again at the beginning so that it gets to the end. You see on the right a drawing of a pair of sneakers by Adidas. These shoes, these white shoes, are made in 100% recyclable material. So whenever they are worn out, then you can send them back to Adidas and they will produce them again. Circular economy is not the absolute answer because it still consumes energy, and energy is mostly oil or coal or things that have damaging impacts. So we have anyhow to reduce the energy. But if we get in that direction, circular economy is a good answer. How could we create circles like that? Well, get inspired by nature. And one great way to do that is follow the trends in biomimicry. Biomimicry means mimicking what the nature does, bio being nature. And I give you only one example among many great ones, because we could spend hours discussing the biomimicry companies and intents and ventures. I'm telling you about this company called Glowy. And Glowy, the idea is to take plankton, so you know these very tiny animals that live in the oceans, and to use plankton to light the cities. When you attack plankton, it emits light. That's a way for plankton to defend itself. If you put that in tubes in the cities, then these tubes will actually light the cities. And at the end, when plankton dies, you can actually return it to the ocean where it will get in the food chain again, or you can use it, for example, to enrich the soils in agriculture or things like that. So Glowy is a great example. There are many, many others. So that's one of the things you could do. Social entrepreneurship. We had this semester at a bachelor level a course called social entrepreneurship. We could call social entrepreneurship the end of shareholder profit maximization. As a finance teacher, I've been teaching shareholder profit maximization for years, and I'm going to tell you something, I'm sick of it. It's enough. I can't do that anymore. If we do only shareholder profit maximization, that's exactly, the consequences are exactly what we've seen until now. That we will accumulate wealth on one side and deficits on the other side, and all the trouble that it creates, and the crazy idea of flying off to Mars with that wealth. So we have to consider much beyond shareholder profit maximization. Social entrepreneurship, the aim is to produce jobs, to care for the environment, generate reasonable, not maximize reasonable profit, and let's be circular again, reinvest that, not pile up the cash like companies like Apple that has $200 billion in cash or near cash and its balance sheet does. So reinvest it. I'll give you 3 examples of social entrepreneurship companies or models. The first one is the you buy, I give model. The first picture here of this young girl who goes to school, it's a company that sells glasses. Whenever you buy a pair of glasses from this company, they give a pair of glasses to people in need who cannot afford them. So the you buy, I give model. The second one, that's the picture in the middle, employ the unemployable. Companies, mostly in the UK, it started there in the United Kingdom, started by employing former prisoners, former convicts, and employing them in farms, in organic farms, to grow food. Here you do create jobs for people who would be unemployable. You care for the environment because you're producing food in an organic way. You generate some profit because you're selling your vegetables, and you reinvest to do that in the higher scale. So that's another model. And the third one is the no-growth businesses. We could have a long discussion on this one, but if you take a restaurant, for example, a restaurant has a limited number of seats, limited space in there. So you can't increase and grow indefinitely in a restaurant unless people start, eating on top of each other, which is not necessarily very cozy. So there are new models that are being created now of restaurants that are created, that operate, and whenever the team that operates the restaurant wants to do something else, instead of buying next door or upstairs or changing the concept and so on, well, they sell it to a new team that does that for a while, and then selling it to a new team and so on. The restaurant doesn't grow. It sells exactly the same amount of food. There is no growth there, and it's a good business. We don't need absolutely to look for more and for growth and for profit all the time. We can just be happy with having an activity that pays salaries, and that goes well like that. So that's social entrepreneurship. Local currencies is another example. Local currencies is a great thing because these local currencies are banknotes, like you see on the right there, that are valid only in a given territory. So the picture on the top right is actually the local currency in my city, in Chambéry, France, across the border with Geneva. It's called the LF, in reference to the elephants which are the symbol of the city. I can pay in LF only in my city and the nearest surroundings. And so this money, being valid only here, cannot be taken away, cannot be taken to a tax haven somewhere. Because in tax haven, nobody wants to see those banknotes. It makes no sense. It's valid only here. So these currencies work fully, really like blood in a body, compared to national currencies that evaporate. If I pay in euros, then to a big company established in my city, part of it will become profit, and this profit might eventually end up somewhere in one of the surpluses that create problem. That cannot happen with local currencies. Another big advantage of these local currencies is that they increase the velocity. Velocity is the number of times the currency changes hands in a year, let's say. In a euro banknote, I feel it's very precious. I want to treasure it and I want to save it for later. This one is not, in my eyes, that precious. I can spend it and it's good, it's circulating, it's helping my local economy. And my spending is someone else's revenue. By increasing the velocity, you increase the revenues locally. So it's a technical way to actually use the currency, use something that is a very economic tool to help the economy and not to generate surpluses. And as you see, one of the main the leaders in this field are in the United Kingdom, the city of Brixton, and you have 10 Brixton pounds here, and they find it so hype and so nice that they even put a picture of David Bowie on top of that. That's much nicer than the picture of a central banker with a tie, I find personally. Two more things and we'll be there. Agriculture is also something that will have to be part of tomorrow's economy. It has been misconsidered for decades, maybe even for centuries. It has been seen as the little thing we don't care about, but that's what feeds us, and we are what we eat to a vast extent. This agriculture needs to be rethought and reorganized completely. You see the picture on the left? Strawberries are growing on something that looks like plastic, and a farmer is spraying something that apparently is so bad that you need to cover your full body, wear gloves, glasses, and even a mask so that you don't get polluted by that. I mean, do you want to eat these strawberries? I don't. And unfortunately, we have. And there, we are not working with nature in circle, we are working against it by being predators again. So we need to move to the picture on the right. There are very interesting things happening in agriculture these days, permaculture, things like that work with nature, not against it, to actually produce a better yield. And there will be a need for good managers. There will be. That's going to be an interesting sector in the coming decades. So that's something that can be considered. And finally, financing, banking. Banks, as we have seen, use our deposits and all the money they have on the balance sheet to fund companies and national debt, but to fund companies, and they get to choose which companies they fund. If you were a banker, would you prefer to fund a tar sand exploitation or tar sand business, as you see on the left there, which is well known for being an absolute ecological catastrophe, or would you rather go for green cities? Well, I hope many of you in the future who want to work in banks will go for these projects that are fair, regenerative, and positive projects. In conclusion, all of that can be summarized that way. I think the future can be bright again. I've got no doubt about that. I'm optimistic about it. But it won't shine the way we thought it would. So join us, join Geneva Business School. Let's invent tomorrow together so that through real business, you become responsible leaders and make the world a better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien. That was very, very insightful. We have 2 questions in the chat. I will post them to you. We have from Daniela and Kamal for you.
Okay. Here we go. So Let me have a check. You measure the debt to GDP and not what is the country's income revenue. Can you expand on that? In fact, GDP is an accounting convention. I'm going to talk about accounting again, sorry, but I'm going to be quick once again. GDP is an accounting convention to calculate the country's income or revenue or value generated. That's a bit synonymous in accounting. So that's really the that's what we produce. If we take a piece of plastic and some ink and we put that together to make a pen, the value will be the difference between the value of the pen and the value of the ink and plastic together. So that's the country's income revenue, if you will. That's what we measure. That's the GDP. I hope it answers your question. And the second one is huge public debt good for the economy in the long run? Well, no, it's not, as we've seen. If the huge public debt grows, then it means huge interest on the debt has to be paid. That means lower public spending and more wealth transfer to the surpluses, and therefore an even more polarized situation where wealth is even bigger and deficits are even bigger as well, and in the middle, not enough investment in the public good. So no, it's huge public debt in the economy in the long run is a bad thing. It's definitely a bad thing. I hope it answers your question, Kamal, as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Damien, once again. As I promised in the beginning of this session, I'm available to respond to any questions you may have related to the programs we offer and to the general admissions process. So please feel free to write them in the chat. Otherwise, since we are running a little bit out of time, you can always email us in this address that I just posted on the chat, admissions@gbsg.com, and we will do our best to help you and guide you. Since you are all here, I would also like to bring to your attention our early bird fee, which will be offered for a very limited time. For all candidates that proceed with their payment and registration during the month of May, we offer an exceptional 50% reduction in the administration fee. So if you're interested, I would advise you to apply as soon as possible in order to benefit from this offer, okay? Do we have any questions in the chat? I don't see anything from your side. If you would like some more information about the school and all the recent positive updates about COVID-19, we will be having a virtual open day for Geneva campus later today at 5 o'clock Swiss time, which means in 2 hours from now. I'll also post the link in the chat, so whoever wants to join can find it easily. Great. So thank you very much for attending today. And I hope to hear from you soon.
Yes, thank you again, everyone. That was a pleasure for me to be with you today. So I hope to see you on the campus very soon.